5 million pounds of green beans that we have destroyed, 8 million pounds of cabbage that we've destroyed. We have to grind it up back into the ground. That's the only choice we have and hope for a better day.
On 23rd April 2020, the Washington Post published this headline. It is a stark reminder of what happens when demand and supply equilibrium is disrupted in an economy. The COVID 19 lockdown across the globe played havoc to long established economic and business models. Many countries saw scarcity of food and other essential items as supply chains started getting disrupted and people started hoarding out of fear. Well, the panic buying and the resultant shortages of toilet paper rolls made for very humorous headlines. The large problem happened when to the food supplies. With restaurants closed, transportation disrupted, and processing plants locked, farmers struggled to sell their supplies, leading to thousands of tons of milk, vegetables, and meats being thrown away. Sadly, while this food was being wasted at the farms, panic buying and shutdown of processing plants during the early days led to shortage in supermarkets. Worse still, the poor people who depended on the food through food banks stood in mile-long queues to get essential food supplies. It is established that COVID 19 added 17 million people to the list of 37 million food insecure Americans. We can understand this better using a simple demand and supply diagram. We can see the demand curve and supply curve of basic food products. They have a price, quantity, and equilibrium point. However, during the initial stages of the pandemic, panic and fear led to bulk buying and hoarding, leading to an increase in short term demand. We can represent this by shifting the demand curve from D to D1. However, this is not the only thing that happened. The shutting down of factories, processing plants, and logistics led to a decrease in supply at the retail level. We can represent this by shifting the supply curve to S1. We can see that we have a new equilibrium point. The prices also increased from P to P1. This led to scarcity and shortages. The unique problem reported in the Washington Post article captures the breakdown of demand and supply equilibrium during the lockdown caused by disrupted supply chains. Let us try to understand what happened from Surbhi Rajaram of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a supply chain expert who joins us from Seattle. So, my first question would be, why is there a shortage of food on one hand, but dumping of excess supplies on the other? So, why is this an imbalance during this lockdown period?
What we saw, and maybe what we saw at an upstream level, right, is we saw certain choke points emerging. Some of those choke points included, sure, the farmers still were growing crops and things were still being produced, cows were still being milked. But when coronavirus hit, in the US, for example, there were huge members of the population who were taken out in the production plants because the way they worked in the food assembly lines were so close. You would see like 70% of this meat processing plant all got coronavirus, and so that production plant had to close. And so what you're left with is, a bunch of, say, whatever, butchers or whoever sitting on meat who had no production plants to send it to for processing and packaging or cleaning, right? Or you had a bunch of dairy farmers who were milking all their cows, but they couldn't send the milk for processing or pasteurization, right? Because these plants were closed, and then all of a sudden your supply chain is interrupted, right? And so the farmers, having no outlet for their products, ended up wasting, right?
The example of the milk industry gives insight on the economics of the lockdown. Half of the nation's cheese and 60% of butter goes to restaurants, and 7% of fluid milk is used in school nutrition programs. After an initial spike in demand in early March, as retail shoppers panic purchased milk at the grocery stores, daily farmers saw a precipitous drop in demand. With schools and restaurants closed, the dairy industry lost its major customers. This led to supply far exceeding the demand. The first impact was on the price. Milk prices dropped 20% to its lowest point in a dozen years. The bigger impact happened due to the rigidness and breakdown of supply chains, which forced milk farmers to start dumping the milk. We can understand this better by using another demand and supply diagram. We can see the demand curve and supply curve of dairy products. They have a price, quantity, and equilibrium point. Due to the shutting down of schools and restaurants, as well as the disruption of supply chains, there was a decrease in demand. We can represent this by shifting the demand curve left from D to D1. However, during this time, supply remained constant as crops had already been harvested and it was difficult to scale down production in the primary sector. This led to a new equilibrium point E1, and price decreased from P to P1 and quantity decreased from Q to Q1. The revenue of the producers also decreased significantly. As explained by Surbi Rajaram, the supply chain in US is extremely rigid and inflexible. It emerged over the years as a means to increase efficiency of production and distribution. Farms that produce for exports versus farms that produce for restaurants are set up differently. They produce different quantities, stock differently, and package differently. They also have different transportation arrangements. As a result, even as local demand diminished, it was not easy for the farmers to divert their stock to exports or other channels due to the rigid system. Hence, efficiencies of the old model led to huge wastage in the new lockdown economy. This led to huge losses of over 20 billion for the food industry. In the complex world we live in, economies of different countries as well as industries within a country are intertwined in an interdependent web. COVID 19 disrupted almost all industries, leading to chain reactions of cause and effect. In my example of the food industry, here is how the chain reaction worked. Shutdown of schools and restaurants resulted in large quantities of unsold produce amongst farmers. Rigid supply chains meant that the excess produce could not be repurposed for supermarkets or other supply systems. This led to farmers destroying their produce, incurring huge losses. At the same time, restaurant businesses as well as food processing industries started losing revenue and jobs. Overall, this meant a significant impact on GDP, unemployment, and individual incomes. Reduced incomes and joblessness led to higher pressure on food banks. However, disrupted supply chains meant shortage of food for the most needy. While the domestic market was disrupted, items that were imported, such as mangoes from India or sugar from Mexico, started disappearing from the market. This not only impacted importers but also exporters in other countries. The airlines that carried these items started to suffer unbearable losses, leading to a global slump in oil prices. This impacted the stock market, which crashed within days, leading to a huge loss for investors and overall wealth of countries. It is because of this vicious cycle that governments around the world were forced to open the lockdowns and the economy despite the continuing exponential growth of coronavirus. So, the last question I would want to ask you is what suggestions do you have? How do you fix this problem and how do you make the supply chain more flexible?
Absolutely. Wow, this is a good question. Um, I would say a few things. I would say that, there's this trade-off we always talk about in supply chain of resiliency versus efficiency. When you look at these private sector companies, they are trying to be lean Six Sigma, operant, efficient to the nth degree. How can we, exactly run on this clock, or this process runs like this, I have all these standard operating procedures. But one hit to that, the whole thing gets messed up, right? Like you almost sustain a huger loss of efficiency because you're not built to be agile. And I think there's a lot to learn when you think about the future supply chain of what does agility look like. And maybe that does look like less reliance on a consolidated market of suppliers. Maybe that looks like diversifying your suppliers. So if one production plant or line takes a hit, you have other alternatives. Maybe that looks like thinking about how you are moving your warehousing or collection centers, say, closer to farmers or things like that, right? Because a huge issue was, how do farmers get their goods to the next step, right, in the process? And maybe that's not the most efficient decision, but it does create a much more resilient supply chain.
There are some other solutions that can also be taken to solve this problem. The first is segmentation. Smarter grouping of products can help prioritize the most important and essential goods, such as dairy products, agricultural products, and meats. This, along with the elimination of goods that take many steps in the supply chain, will help these goods move through the supply chain more easily and into the hands of a large number of people. The second is emergency provisions. The public sector can supply emergency supplies at a large scale in existing food banks. This will give a reliable source of food for unemployed people. The last is policy. The government can get certain people listed as essential workers, such as truck drivers who transport the food or factory workers who work in processing plants. Doing this will allow the supply chain to work more smoothly. The second thing that can be done is put a limit on how many food items can be purchased at a time. This will prevent hoarding and shortages. Finally, the government had to intervene. The Trump administration announced a 19 billion package to bail out farmers and distribute the produce to those in need. It announced that it will purchase 300 million per month in fresh fruits, vegetables, dairy products and meat. The USDA will pay distributors directly to pick up available food from farmers and producers and truck it to food banks. Let's hope that the disruptions caused by COVID 19 will soon be over and the economy can get back on track.